Welcome back to The Smart Life. I'm Olga Villaverde. Have you ever been worried about your kids or your loved ones' video game habits? There are some obvious risks involved with spending hours playing video games. But believe it or not, according to researchers, there are also some benefits in some cases. Joining us to talk about that is licensed psychologist Dr. Carolyn Rubenstein. Dr. Rubenstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and talk all things gaming and mental health and the boom that we're seeing in the gaming world right now.
Exactly, and because of this
Yes.
pandemic. But first, doctor, before we
Yeah.
talk about how much it's risen because of the fact that we've been home so much, let's start with the definition of what gaming actually is. Is it just, playing video games, or is there more to gaming?
So it's really a nuanced term, to be honest. It encompasses any type of game that's on a console, a computer, a phone, usually over the internet. So that's when we think about gaming, we're usually thinking about something that's happening over the internet. Can be played solo, can be played with others, and there's so many different types of games. But gaming is a very, very broad term.
And I was reading here, doctor, there is a statistic that shows 80% of gamers are over 18 years old. So, I mean, can we assume that gamers are mostly adults? Is that what we're talking about?
So you know what? It's actually fascinating when I saw that statistic because yes, 80% are 18 plus, but interestingly enough, most kids, so I think it's 70% of children under 18 also play video games. So because there are more adults in America, that percentage is a little kind of inflated, but there are a lot of 18 to 34-year-olds that are playing video games. That's the massive majority of people. But we've also got a lot of adolescents and younger kids playing as well.
All right, so let's talk about the fact that, it has risen over the last year, but this has been popular for such a long time. I mean, when I was young in my teenage years, I remember playing Space Invaders. I don't even know if anybody remembers that for that matter, and Centipedes. I loved those games, but we didn't really do a
Uh-huh.
lot of it. It was just kind of like a pastime, spend Friday night with your friends. It seems like now with the pandemic, because people are home so much, has it just been like overkill, if you will?
I wouldn't say that it's been overkill. I think that it has taken a much different place within our lives. So, for example, I have a 7-year-old, and the only way that he was able to connect with his friends was through playing video games that are targeted towards those kids at that age. And so he was able to maintain and actually build friendships with others through the pandemic through video games. And so, in that sense, it really replaced for him what he would normally get at school on the playground, he got through video games. But also entertainment, escapism, those are things that we really needed, especially during the hardest parts of the pandemic. And video game definitely provided that as an outlet and resource.
And that's a good point. So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons, because obviously, like you said,
Yeah.
video games helped people connect, helped people to remain in contact, if you will. But there is something that I read here, a disorder. And this is regarding the American Psychological Association. I've never heard of this, doctor. It's called Internet Gaming Disorder, IGD. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. So it's actually not an official disorder. It's up for discussion. So it's included in what's the psychologists use called the DSM-5 as a condition that warrants further study. And so what IGD or internet gaming disorder really is looking at the someone's playing patterns over a 12-month period. And so looking at, does the person become preoccupied with gaming? Do they become dependent on gaming? And there are very specific criteria that you look at, and you want to see over the past 12 months, does this person meet 5 of the criteria? And usually it's not just playing video games, it's also looking at, is there an impairment in functioning? So are we looking at difficulties in socializing? Are we looking at difficulties at work? And seeing how far the effects of gaming kind of span outwards. And I think there was a study done when they were looking at this diagnosis that showed when you look at the broad population, that I think it's 0.3 to 1% may meet criteria for this diagnosis if it were included. So it is a very tiny percentage, but it's worth discussion and worth consideration when thinking about it and also assessing video game use.
Doctor, are there warning signs that parents, siblings, people should look out for where it does get to that point that you say, hold on, this
Yeah.
is a bit much?
Yeah, of course. So I think any of the criteria for internet gaming disorder, almost becoming preoccupied with gaming, using it as an escape mechanism. So, are you using gaming to avoid something that's happening in your real life outside of gaming? And looking at the motivation for gaming and seeing if it's becoming, are you avoiding something at the cost of playing your games? Are you having a hard time, stepping back if you need to from gaming, looking at for these signs before they become something bigger. And if they are an issue and if there are signs, talking about it, because I think that's where people feel very uncomfortable is saying, hey, I noticed that you're avoiding this thing. Tell me a little bit about that. And not really just jumping into let's take away the video games, but kind of exploring and communicating openly about what's noticed.
We're going to get to the pros, I promise, but there's one more
Yes,
con I want
of
to
course.
touch upon. And these are physical ones. And this is really serious. I mean, carpal tunnel syndrome, gamer's thumb, and here's the big one, obesity. And that's a reality, doctor, because when you are playing video games, you're just stagnant, you're not moving. Those are issues, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think those are issues that we're seeing even beyond gaming. We're seeing with increased social media use, we're seeing with being on our computers, especially being home, working from home and on our computers for long periods of time, the overuse of using our hands and our fingers from texting. So there's something called gamer's thumb. There's also something called texter thumb. And so anything that's used to an extreme and repetitively, you want to be concerned. The idea of the sedentariness with gaming, of course, even I work from home and I'm a clinician, I have a reminder on my watch that I'm usually wearing that says I have to get up at least once an hour and walk around and move because whenever we're sitting for long periods of time, we need to make sure that we're supplementing that and we are doing things that also maintain movement and momentum. But it's important to recognize that a lot of pro athletes are avid video game players. So it's not a direct association between if we play video games, we're going to be sedentary. It's just one thing that you want to be aware of and to consider.
All right, let's talk about some pros here. The first one I want to talk about
Yeah.
is cognitive benefits. There are many of those. Touch upon that if you can,
Yes.
doctor.
There are. I think especially what we're seeing is that it allows for an increase in working memory, increased multi-focusing, multitasking. But I think especially what we see when we're looking at adolescence is an increase in frustration tolerance. So learning how to deal with, I lost, that point, but I got to get back up and I have to manage my frustration and my emotions. And so learning how to regulate emotions in a very kind of a productive way versus a way where you're ruminating and focusing because gaming does not reinforce taking a time out to kind of focus on what you're frustrated by.
And another great thing, and you mentioned a little bit about it with your 7-year-old son, the social
Yeah.
component, the being able to connect with somebody. I think there are many gaming communities and tournaments out there. So that really, if you want to talk about it a little bit with me, but I can see the social aspect, the fun, the energy involved with something like that.
Yeah, and I think what's really, really amazing about it is for some kids who aren't into athletics or into sports, it gives them something if they are into gaming that they can do as a team. And so there are team video game teams at high schools now, in colleges, and people are playing in that way. And so we're able to have that team environment. And you're also able to go with friends to meetups to watch competitive video game playing. You're able to go to tournaments, you're able to go to all these things and take gaming from being an online only element to also being offline, which is so important to see.
And so important, especially with kids and teenagers and even young adults that unfortunately for so long
Yes.
were isolated, doing virtual learning. Many of them felt lonely. Lots of them didn't have their friends. So I think that really helps too in terms of just the mental health benefit, doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that connection and maintaining that connection in a way that's just easy and accessible and can allow that connection in a medium despite where you are in the world, despite your background. I think that's the way that it allows connection despite so many differences, whether it be geographic or cultural or language, that it brings people together, which is the core part of gaming that often gets missed.
Absolutely. We only have a few minutes left, doctor, but
Mm.
do you have any personal stories you
Yes.
can share based on your research experience with gaming in our culture?
Yeah, so I would say what I've noticed is that gaming tends to be looked at as a continuum, but we tend to focus on this top 1% of people that are playing gaming in extremes versus most people that are playing gaming for recreation. And so, some examples that I've seen in terms of some things I've noticed in gaming, interestingly enough, is ways that it allows families to connect with possibly their adolescents. So, bringing gaming out of the bedroom and moving it, for example, into the living room. It allows it to be something that brings people together in the family that may not come together normally, and bringing it out of kind of that isolated experience. Also in therapy. So when we had to go virtual as clinicians, gaming became something that a lot of clinicians had to learn pretty quickly because it is something that we often will do in the therapy room is play a board game with a kid or just play something together to bring and build that rapport. And so gaming allowed clinicians to connect with adolescents. And many clinicians, based on the communities that I'm involved in, are going to continue to use gaming as a way to build that connection, especially with adolescents that may be more hesitant to talk about their feelings. Gaming provides a medium where they can actually teach the clinician something, feel confident about something, break down the barrier. And with that comes that vulnerability of talking about how they're feeling, what's going on, and kind of opening up in a way that feels safe.
Well, I know I'm a dinosaur, but there's one game that I forgot to mention that I remember
Mhm.
years ago. We went into a store and it was right there, Miss Pac-Man. Remember that one?
Of course, who doesn't remember that one? That's the best one.
I know. And my daughters challenged me to a game, and guess who won?
Oh, goodness. I would bet
I
you.
was the
I would bet you
best
as well.
at Miss Pac-Man.
Of course.
Doctor, thank
Of
you.
course. Thank you so much. It was so great talking with you.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you, doctor,
Mm,
very much.
thank you. Thank you.